And welcome to Houstonic.live, episode 280.A, 280.A, or, because I like to use a little bit of hexadecimal, it's actually 280.10, but to reduce the number of characters, it's going to be 280.A. We are continuing on with the narration of the book Germs by Judith Miller, Stephen Engelberg, William Broad. This is the 10th episode, and it corresponds or correlates to Chapter 10 in the book, The President, which begins on page 333. I'm not into numerology. Some people will be like, ooh, but I don't really get into that stuff. So Chapter 10 in the book, The President, starts on page 333. And in the Amazon Audible audiobook, which I hope can just do most of the work for me because this guy is his profession, is his voice. It starts around chapter 4 in the Amazon Audible audiobook, around minute 33 and 12 or 13 seconds or so. As we've said before, significant quantities of the actual book, the PDF, have not been captured in the Amazon Audible audiobook. Book was released on September 7th, 9th, 2001. Obviously, greatly projecting a large-scale biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center. And the book focuses mostly on the FDA, anthrax vaccines, and even genetics. And we've been doing some additional backstories as well. So, without any further ado, let's just get into it. You can go to Houstonic.live, Housatonic.live, click on playlists, then from there click on Germs. There's actually a playlist for Germs, and you can view the page with all of these episodes. You can watch each of these episodes on YouTube via our Houstonic Live 2 channel on YouTube, or BitChute, or Odyssey, or Rumble, or stream.gigahome.bio, which is a PeerTube instance shared with Jonathan Cooey at Gigahome Biological, gigahomebiological.com, GIGAOHMBIO LOGICAL.com, gigahome.biological.com. Or now Spotify. Just started to upload a few videos onto Spotify. I mean, why not?
The President. In late December 1997, President Clinton traveled to the resort island of Hilton Head, South Carolina for the Renaissance Weekend, an invitation-only gathering of officials and private citizens who liked to ring in the new year with readings from Kierkegaard and half-day seminars devoted to such topics as moral compasses for modern leaders. One night, Clinton arranged to have dinner with J. Craig Venter, a molecular biologist who was pioneering the effort to map the genes of germs and people.
Off the bat. It is noteworthy that the Amazon Audible audiobook crossed out the sentence that highlighted Claire Venter, or Claire Fraser now, is a scientist who was married to J. Craig Venter at the time of this book. They were married for 10 or 15 years or so. And she was also a very critical person with respect to the Institute of Genomic Research, or TIGER, and also, I believe, working after 2001 to do the sequencing of the strain of anthrax, which was in the anthrax letters, and to help identify the source. So a very curious omission, that part out. So I'm going to start this paragraph again from the beginning. One night, Clinton, President Bill Clinton, arranged to have dinner with J. Craig Venter, a molecular biologist who was pioneering the effort to map the genes of germs and people. Venter and his wife, Claire, also a scientist, had been invited to dine with the Clintons at the previous year's Renaissance Weekend and were thrilled and slightly surprised that scientists would be asked again. The dinner party included only 4 couples, and Clinton and Venter spent much of the evening locked in conversation.
Their talk turned to what the strides in genetic mapping would mean for germ warfare, an issue on which Venter had strong views. As head of the Maryland-based Institute for Genomic Research, a non-profit group that deciphered microbes, he had recently helped map the smallpox virus. Venter warned Clinton that such work could be extraordinarily dangerous in the wrong hands, allowing a foe to reconstruct the rare microscopic killer. Most of the discussion was about smallpox and synthetic microorganisms and how to come up with effective defenses, Venter recalled. The president was extremely knowledgeable already. He said throughout history the biggest changes have come when there were new offensive weapons without defensive ones, and he was worried that we were entering such a period. Clinton asked if smallpox could be spliced with another bug to make it more harmful. Venter replied that it could, and that a new novel, The Cobra Event, written by Richard Preston, author of The Hot Zone, presented just such a scenario. He urged the president to read it.
Oh, it's the small omissions that are so telling. The book actually says that The Cobra Event, the thriller that Richard Preston had written with Richard Danzig's encouragement, remember, Secretary of the United States Navy, presented just a scenario. I will say that in the previous chapter, it was either chapter 7 or 8, it actually reviewed how Richard Preston received a lot of information about how to write the book and the technical capabilities of recombinant DNA, etc., via conversations with Joshua Lederberg. So this book here already disclosed that. So the original book isn't necessarily censoring that, masking that out. However, the Amazon Audible audiobook cut out that part and now also cut out the reminder that Richard Preston written the novel, The Cobra Event, with Richard Danzig's encouragement.
Venter described smallpox as more dangerous than anthrax, even in its unaltered state. It was contagious wildfire, he told the president, a killer that leapt from person to person. By contrast, anthrax was incommunicable. It killed only where sprayed.
Craig Venter's comparison of anthrax and smallpox made a deep impression on Thomas Schneider, Schneider, who was a Washington businessman and friend of Clinton's, who had organized and attended the two dinners. The smallpox warning, he recalled, was, quote, really talking about the impact on humans, unquote, especially civilians. And the superbug issue, Thomas Schneider said, made smallpox and other bugs seem even more of a poor man's weapon.
Offering quick reassurance, Venter told Clinton that the gene mapping done at such places as his institute offered a new way to strengthen the nation's germ defenses. They could help create innovative cures and identify pathogens used in an attack by revealing their genetic signatures.
Narrator's note: I want it to be seen, clear as day, that the book Germs, released on September 7th, 9th, 2001, which talks significantly about the FDA and the anthrax vaccines and all the scenarios and discussions about using the anthrax vaccine and new generation anthrax vaccines should there be a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center such as New York City that blocks out things such as crop dusters being used on crowds and so on, now has a chapter involving one of the key people with respect to the Human Genome Project, Craig Venter. When President Bill Clinton celebrated the completion of the Human Genome Project in the year 2000, an event where none other than Kevin McKernan actually attended the White House and was on Geraldo Rivera during that week at some time, the two people that were on the stage who were celebrated as the people that made this completion of the Human Genome Project possible were Francis Collins and Craig Venter.
I want to, first of all, acknowledge Prime Minister Blair, who will join us by satellite in just a moment from London. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions not only that their scientists, but also scientists from China made to the vast international consortium that is the Human Genome Project. I thank Secretary Shalala, who could not be here today, and Secretary Richardson, who is here, Dr. Ruth Kirstein, Dr. Ari Patronos, scientists of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Energy, who have played an important role in the Human Genome Project. I want to say a special word of thanks to my science advisor, Dr. Neil Lane, and of course to Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the International Human Genome Project, and to the SOLARA president, Craig Venter. We are here to celebrate the completion of the first survey of the entire human genome. Without a doubt, this is the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. More than 1,000 researchers across 6 nations have revealed nearly all 3 billion letters of our miraculous genetic code. Today, we are learning the language in which God created life. We are gaining ever more awe for the complexity, the beauty, the wonder of God's most divine and sacred gift. With this profound new knowledge, humankind is on the verge of gaining immense new power to heal. Genome science will have a real impact on all our lives, and even more, on the lives of our children. It will revolutionize the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of most, if not all, human diseases. In coming years, doctors increasingly will be able to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, and cancer by attacking their genetic roots. Now, it is my great pleasure to turn to my friend, Prime Minister Tony Blair, who is joined in the state dining room at 10 Downing Street by Dr. Fred Sanger and other world-renowned scientists. And on a personal note, I can't help but think that the year of your son's birth will always be remembered for the remarkable achievements we announced today. I think his life expectancy has just gone up by about 25 years.
And Craig Venter is also a key person in here. And it goes on to say that the technologies are going to help identify pathogens, and that's exactly what Claire Fraser used the technology for, according to the official narrative. Of course, Claire Fraser's name was already blocked out of the post 9/11 Amazon Audible audiobook, but also the role of the Human Genome Project and PCR testing, etc., all key issues with respect to the next 20 years and even up into, including, and then now enabled by COVID-19. This is not a coincidence.
Offering quick reassurance, Venter told Clinton that the gene mapping done at such places as his institute offered a new way to strengthen the nation's germ defenses. It could help create innovative cures and identify pathogens used in an attack by revealing their genetic signatures. The next day, Clinton sent an assistant to see Venter. The aide said the president would be grateful if the biologist would prepare a list of experts who could advise him on the topics they had discussed. Venter was delighted. In the months that followed, he talked repeatedly with the White House about possible candidates for the panel. Clinton had long been fascinated by the promise and peril of the new biology. His concern arose in part from the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had put tens of thousands of scientists privy to the technological secrets of mass destruction on the job market. The threat, Clinton would tell his aides, was obvious. He had also come to see the danger of germ weapons in the context of terrorist incidents that had marked his presidency. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City had been done with simple fertilizer bombs, the subway gassings in Tokyo with home-brewed sarin. Clinton saw germs as the next logical step for terrorists. The president started inserting warnings in all his speeches, said Dick Clark, the National Security Council advisor on counterterrorism. Even if the subject was not relevant, he would start talking about bioterrorism as the dark side of globalization. Again and again he would say, what if the World Trade Center and Oklahoma City had been a biological or chemical event? Clinton was a hands-on editor of his own speeches, and Clark said the germ references were his idea. At first we thought, well, this will pass. The president is interested in lots of things, Clark said. But it didn't pass. He kept after us. He wouldn't let it go. It wasn't just a whim. He was obsessed with it. Clinton's fascination with germ weapons was deepened by his reading. He devoured histories, newspaper and magazine articles, and especially fiction. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six, a thriller about a counter-terrorist team's efforts to prevent Armageddon, made a big impression. Another favorite was a Patricia Cornwell novel that focused on a female medical examiner's battle against a shadowy figure intent on using mutant smallpox for mass murder. But nothing caught the president's attention as much as The Cobra Event, the novel Venter had recommended and that Clinton read in early 1998. It depicted a mad scientist's determination to thin the world's population by infecting New York City with a designer pathogen. By combining smallpox, a virus similar to that of the common cold, and an insect virus that destroys nerves, the scientist invented an ideal doomsday germ, a brain pox that spread quickly and melted the brain.
The book opened with 17-year-old Kate Moran, I believe she's a fictional character, Kate Moran, heading off to her private high school in Upper Manhattan. She had a bad cold. By art class, her teeth were chattering and her nose was gushing. Disoriented, she soon found herself seized by convulsions and, bizarrely, biting her own mouth. She collapsed, her body lashing back and forth, her face twitching uncontrollably. With classmates and a teacher standing by helplessly, she died a violent death, her spine cracking under the strain of her contracting muscles. The psychopath behind the killings also eventually fell victim to the bug he had created. It was a plot twist Joshua Lederberg had suggested to Richard Preston at the outset of his research to make germ weapons seem less attractive to a potential terrorist.
Clinton was impressed by the book's grim narrative and apparent authenticity. Preston's acknowledgments included more than 100 experts, military officers, intelligence analysts, doctors, scientists, and officials in Clinton's own administration, including Danzig. The novel's science, Preston wrote in a preface, is real or based on what is possible. Clinton began asking his friends, cabinet members, even House Speaker Newt Gingrich whether they had read the book and what they thought about it. After a White House meeting on another topic, the president suddenly turned to John Hamre, now serving as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and asked whether he could speak to him privately for a few moments. As the two men walked into the Oval Office, Clinton said he had recently read The Cobra Event and asked Hamre whether he thought the novel's scenario was plausible. Could a terrorist unleash an unstoppable plague with designer pathogens? Hamre was somewhat taken aback. He had not read the book and was no expert on superbugs or recombinant technology, he told the president. But I'll have 100 colonels reading the book at dawn, he promised. Returning to the Pentagon, Hamre searched in vain for the book. He finally borrowed the only one he could find, a copy from Secretary Cohen's private library. The next day, Hamre delivered a preliminary assessment to the White House. While the novel was not based on secret government data and contained no classified information, the scenario was theoretically plausible. In February 1998, the arcane intelligence debates about Russia's biological program exploded into public view. Ken Alabek emerged from anonymity to charge publicly what he had said in secret government debriefings. The Russians were still making sophisticated bioweapons under the guise of developing vaccines for defense. In interviews with the New York Times and ABC's Primetime Live, Alabek said that the Soviet Union's plans for World War III had included hundreds of tons of anthrax bacteria and scores of tons of smallpox and plague viruses. And he repeated in public his controversial charge that the Soviet labs had made hybrid designer germs from Ebola and smallpox that were impervious to vaccines and antibiotics. As Alabek stunned legislators on Capitol Hill who had not known of the defectors' existence, Andy Weber was making real progress in Russia. The gamble that Weber and his State Department colleague Ann Harrington had taken the previous September had paid off. Less than 24 hours after receiving the email they had sent him, Lev Sandakchev, Vector's director, had invited the Americans to visit his Siberian Institute.
He did more than just welcome his former Cold War rivals to his deteriorating facility. He gradually permitted them to photograph the most sensitive labs in the sprawling 100-building complex that previously had been off-limits to foreigners and even most Russians. Before the visits, an interagency group at the White House had carefully weighed the invitation as well as the potential risks and benefits of scientific cooperation with Vector and other former Soviet institutes. Senior administration officials recognized that Russia might try to use American money or expertise for its own purposes, perhaps even in an ongoing germ weapons program. But they sensed that cooperation might also provide valuable insights into Soviet biowarfare activities and help thwart Iranian attempts to recruit Russians. After several tense meetings in the fall of 1997, the interagency group endorsed the Vector visit and broader efforts to engage former Soviet bioweaponeers through cooperation with their institutes. It insisted that military officials, intelligence analysts, and other government experts review each proposed project for its risks and scientific merit, adding enormously to the analysts' workload. The group also ensured that money for such projects would be paid directly to the Russian scientists and that the projects would be closely audited. The group's recommendations were described to President Clinton in a memo from Samuel R. or Sandy Berger, the National Security Advisor. Clinton blessed the approach by scribbling his assessment of the gamble in the memo's margin. Difficult, he wrote, but necessary. Subsequent American visits to Vector were a resounding success. Now, I want to add one more thing here. Remember, this book was published on September 7th or 9th of 2001. Let's go to Houstonic.live, playlist. Okay. The video is on the evening of September 11th, 2001 on the Charlie Rose Show. None other than Judith Miller was in the studio. That's kind of odd. Now, she didn't look relaxed. She looked a little disheveled. I don't believe that she knew of the events that were going to happen on September 11th, 2001. But I believe at some point during that day, she was briefed on what really went down. Also there was Tom Clancy, I believe was just mentioned a little while ago, Senator John Edwards, Democrat, North Carolina, and Wesley Clark. Because there's other people there as well.
There are more questions this evening than there are answers. Questions such as how many casualties, who did it, how will the United States respond, and what will this event do to the nature of American life? Joining us this evening for this live broadcast are a distinguished group of public officials and journalists. They include General Wesley Clark from Little Rock, Arkansas, former UN Ambassador Richard Holbrooke here in New York, former National Security Advisor to President Clinton Samuel Berger here in New York.
So Samuel Sandy Berger is there as well. So that's kind of remarkable that all of these characters that are in this book that nobody talks about, the key people in a book that projected an event more clearly than any other book out there, are in the studio of Charlie Rose on the evening of September 11th, 2001. And you can bet Sandy Berger knows exactly what's going on because he just read the Cobra event, which also perfectly projects all the challenges which America and the world are going to be facing.
American experts were eventually permitted to tour Building 6, which housed the well-guarded smallpox laboratory, the huge aerosol test chamber, and the high containment labs where research on the other exotic agents was being conducted. They spoke at length to Vector scientists about their work and saw a video describing a controversial Vector expedition to a remote Siberian village. There, scientists had unearthed the long-frozen bodies of turn-of-the-century smallpox victims and taken samples from them. American teams visited new projects where the scientists who had once turned viruses into weapons were struggling to produce such commercial products as yogurt and a new line of cosmetics. And they were told that American researchers would soon be invited to spend weeks, even months, at Vector, working on joint projects with their Russian counterparts. Now, on a bitterly cold February day, Weber emerged from touring Buildings 6 and 6A, two adjacent four-story brick buildings where the Soviets had done some of their most sensitive work on Marburg and other deadly viruses. The U.S. effort to engage the Russians was working. The American team had visited every part of the compound that intelligence analysts had previously identified as suspicious, and they were now convinced that Vector was no longer engaged in offensive germ research and development. Equally important, the American team and Sandakchiev had quietly struck an agreement restricting Vector's contacts with Iran for at least a year. The so-called Gentleman's Agreement, negotiated by a towel-clad Vector scientist and U.S. officials in the Institute's Banya, or sauna, prescribed cooperation that had military uses with Tehran. While Vector could sell pharmaceutical products to Iranian companies, Sandakchiev agreed not to exchange scientific visits, engage in collaborative research, or provide Iran with Russian research and development expertise and technology. The agreement was unprecedented. It was repeated in subsequent verbal compacts with other leading cash-strapped germ institutes, including the one at Obelensk, whose collection of several thousand bacterial pathogens had long worried Western analysts. General Nikolai N. Yurakov, Obelensk's long-serving director, pledged not only to forego commercial and scientific contacts with Iran, but also to lift what he called the curtain of secrecy that enshrouded the 25-year-old complex and spurred doubts about its supposed conversion from military to peaceful research.
Meanwhile, Andy Weber received encouraging news from Washington. American military scientists had analyzed soil samples that American teams had brought back from anthrax burial pits in Vozrozhdenia Island in 1997. And you can learn more about that if you go back and listen to the chapter about Andy Weber again. Samples from 6 of 11 burial pits showed that some of the bleach-soaked anthrax spores the Russians had buried there almost a decade earlier was still alive and potentially dangerous. Preliminary analysis suggested that the anthrax shots being given American soldiers seemed to be effective against the strain found on the island. Whether America's vaccine would work against the super anthrax Alabac had created or other Soviet strains was still unknown. But now there was one less thing to worry about. One more narrator's note. It's interesting that there's this narrative being seeded, no pun intended, of the anthrax vaccine working against the old anthrax vaccine, but maybe there's some new anthrax out there, some genetically engineered anthrax. Maybe if the anthrax vaccine is given and troops are then subjected to anthrax, and if it doesn't work, well, maybe it just happens to be the new anthrax that the troops happen to encounter. So by seeding so many different permutations, you could see how multiple bases were covered.
Not everyone shared Weber's enthusiasm for what administration officials were calling the vector model.
Andy Weber and Ann Harrington had dispensed with some of the kabuki dance of diplomacy, formalistic inspections and letters of protest. They were working on the theory that cooperative projects paid for with American cash could build trust, foster partnerships between Russian and American scientists, prevent the spread of bioweapons expertise, and persuade the Russians to open up previously closed facilities. The Russians would reject Iranian overtures and reveal the remaining secrets of the Soviet biowarfare program, Andy Weber believed, if they had some incentive to do it. While many American intelligence analysts remained skeptical about the growing Russian-American biological cooperation, they acknowledged that they now lacked compelling evidence that neither Vector or Obelisк was continuing its germ warfare research and development. In early 1998, the institutions were removed from the administration's list of suspected sites. But the analysts soon focused their suspicions on Russia's 4 leading military labs, the facilities in Zagorsk, Kirov, Sverdlovsk, or Yekaterinburg, and Strytsy. All remained closed to Western government officials, and little was known about what was going on inside of them. So there was no way to ensure the American money and biotechnological expertise were not being shared with Russian germ warriors at those closed military labs to make new generations of deadlier germ weapons. Weber and his colleagues were well-intentioned fools, a former intelligence officer complained.
The Russians were taking the American handouts and laughing all the way to their secret labs. Given what he was learning about the former Soviet program, Weber couldn't discount such concerns. The breadth and depth of the program were shocking, even to supporters of the new cooperative effort. Just as Alabac had asserted, almost every Soviet ministry and important institution had played some role in the top-secret program. The Ministry of Defense, the Ministries of Agriculture, Health, and Science, the Communist Party Central Committee, and even the eminent National Academy of Science. The Ministry of Internal Affairs had provided prison labor to build the vast biowarfare complexes, as well as additional guards to supplement the military in protecting them. The Ministry of External Trade had secretly helped purchase equipment and animals for experiments. A special office in the Soviet Ministry of Justice had provided legal services and special courts for the Weapons Institute's personnel. The KGB had its own germ centers for developing methods of assassination. The murkiest parts of the Soviet effort were 2 closely related programs that were aimed at using genetically engineered germs and toxins to cause psychological and physiological changes. The first, called Bonfire, was overseen by a part of Biopreparat that even Alabac knew little about. That program had apparently created a new toxic weapon that manipulates peptides, the short chains of amino acids that send signals to the central nervous system. Such weapons could, in theory, alter moods, sleep patterns, and heart rhythms, all without detection. They could even kill, which explained why the KGB was particularly interested in them. The second program, whose codename was Fleta, which translates to flute, was run by the Ministry of Health's Third Directorate. Its main goal was to create psychotropic and neurotropic germ agents for the KGB, again using peptides and other bioregulators. Another focus of concern was the Research Center of Molecular Diagnostics and Therapy, which would soon start work on enzymes and vaccines to combat a variety of diseases, thanks to International Science and Technology Center grants, largely from the United States. During the Cold War, the Institute had developed psychotropic agents and peptides to alter mood and behavior as part of the Flute program. The Institute was in the heart of downtown Moscow, near a hospital for alcoholics, drug addicts, and other social misfits. American officials had been told by what they called an impeccable source that the facility had tested its peptides and mood-altering agents on the patients confined to the hospital next to the lab. Though its director and staff vehemently denied the allegations, other Russian scientists insisted that the lab and other institutes as well had violated a profound moral taboo, the ban on human experimentation. Russian officials had adamantly denied the charge, which had been raised before, but Americans felt certain their sources were in a position to know about the testing. American officials were unable to learn more about the fate of the patients who had allegedly been subjected to flute testing. Few Russian scientists knew which particular peptides or agents had been given to patients or how many such experiments had been conducted. No Russian official would confirm, even in private, that such experimentation had occurred.
Washington also remained uneasy about Vozrozhdenia Island, the Soviet Union's major open-air germ testing site in the Aral Sea. Since the early 1990s, American intelligence agencies had collected unconfirmed reports that the Soviet military had tested smallpox on part of the island that it controlled. According to scientists and residents of the region, the Soviets had buried not only anthrax from Sverdlovsk, but also debris associated with the smallpox testing in as many as 30 separate pits on the island. Biopreparat scientists had told the Americans they knew nothing of such testing. But that proved nothing, given the intense rivalry between the Soviet military labs and the civilian cover organization. Similar reports continued to flow into the CIA. They were marked top secret and shared with only a handful of specially cleared analysts. The director of a former Soviet lab said in an interview that he had information suggesting that the Soviets had tested smallpox on the island. Bakit B. Ashtabar, or Atshabar, that's Atshabar, the director of the Anti-Plague Institute of now independent Kazakhstan, said that testing had probably caused an outbreak of the disease in neighboring Aralsk in 1971. According to detailed records filed by physicians from a branch of his institute who had struggled to contain the epidemic, he said, 9 people, including children, had developed smallpox, 3 of whom died. Though the physician's reports did not specifically mention Vozrozhdenia Island, he and other scientists at his institute, which was once part of the Soviet germ warfare empire, were convinced that the epidemic had its roots in tests on the island. There had been no other outbreaks in the region for several years, he said, and the illness had never even been reported to the World Health Organization. In early 1998, Dick Clark, the White House counterterrorism coordinator, set out to build the case for strengthening the nation's defenses against germ attacks. In his view, not enough had been done since the 1995 gas attack in the Tokyo subways. The money appropriated by Congress had gone mostly to hire FBI agents and train first responders, such as police, firefighters, and other emergency management officials. A tiny fraction of the funding was used to subsidize Russian scientists, but few steps had been taken to protect the civilian population. The United States had no stockpiles of vaccines or antibiotics, and planning for an outbreak was at an impasse, an awkward standoff among the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Departments of Justice and Defense and the FBI.
Some narrator notes.
Remember, this was the X-Files in 1998 at the same time that this is happening regarding discussions about FEMA.
We were young men in the military. Your father and I were recruited for a project. They told us it was biological warfare, a virus.
What killed those men?
What killed them, I won't even write about. We have no context for what killed those men, or any appreciation of the scale at which it'll be unleashed in the future.
A plague?
A plague to end all plagues, Agent Mulder. A silent weapon for a quiet war. The systematic release of an indiscriminate organism for which the men who will bring it on still have no cure. They've been working on this for 50 years. While the rest of the world have been fighting gooks and commies, these men have been secretly negotiating a planned Armageddon.
Negotiating with whom?
I think you know. The timetable has been set. It'll happen on a holiday when people are away from their homes. The president will declare a state of emergency, at which time all government, all federal agencies will come under the power of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, the secret government.
Just to review, this is the X-Files saying that there's going to be viruses used. It's all been planned. It's going to happen during a holiday. Now, why would it happen when people are away from their homes? I think, to be more precise, it would have been when people were congregated outside. What could be more patriotic than Thanksgiving Day? Thanksgiving Day morning in New York City. How many hundreds of thousands of people are outside? It's usually a very beautiful day, sort of a calm day. It could be a little cold, but I doubt it's warm. As a matter of fact, it would be a little bit breezy. Thanksgiving Day would be the ultimate day for such an event using crop dusters, which is only really several weeks, maybe a couple months, depending upon how you want to package it up, after September 11th, 2001. It would have been after hearings, which were already scheduled to be held and were held in the United States Congress regarding this concern of about a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center. It would have resulted, potentially, in a secret government agency taking full control of the United States. It would have been FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority. It's all being laid out in this book, a book that no one wants to mention. Even the X-Files was telling us about it in 1998. The United States had no stockpiles of vaccines or antibiotics, and planning for an outbreak was at an impasse, an awkward standoff among the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Departments of Justice and Defense and the FBI.
In March 1998, more than 40 senior members of the Clinton administration gathered at Blair House to rehearse how they might handle a biological attack by terrorists. It was what the government calls a tabletop exercise. Dick Clark, the National Security Council advisor on counterterrorism, had convened the officials to give them a hands-on sense of the decisions they might face as an infection rocketed through a panicked population. The results of the drill were not encouraging. Local medical offices rapidly exhausted their stocks of antibiotics and vaccines. Federal quarantine laws turned out to be too antiquated to deal with the rapidly spreading epidemic.
Oh, my Lord. Did you see what they just cut out about the tabletop exercises? Dick Clark had convened the officials to give them a hands-on sense of the decisions they might face as an infection rocketed through a panicked population. For help drawing up the scenario, Clark's staff turned to William A. Haseltine, an expert on genetic engineering and founder of Human Genome Sciences, a company that identified and patented genes for drug development. The founder of Human Genome Sciences was used as the subject matter expert for how to handle crisis management for a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center in tabletop exercises in March 1998. That was selectively omitted from the Amazon Audible audiobook.
In March 1998, more than 40 senior members of the Clinton administration gathered at Blair House to rehearse how they might handle a biological attack by terrorists. It was what the government calls a tabletop exercise. Dick Clark, the National Security Council advisor on counterterrorism, had convened the officials to give them a hands-on sense of the decisions they might face as an infection rocketed through a panicked population.
For help in drawing up a scenario, Dick Clark's staff turned to William A. Haseltine, an expert on genetic engineering and the founder of Human Genome Sciences, a company that identified and patented genes for drug development. In Dick Clark's scenario, terrorists spread a genetically engineered virus in California and the Southwest along the Mexican-American border. After doctors diagnosed the epidemic as smallpox, public health officials rushed in with vaccine to immunize the population. But what was initially diagnosed as smallpox turned out to be the sort of hybrid that Audiobook and the Soviets had been developing, a combination of smallpox and the Marburg virus. Though not highly contagious, Marburg causes a hemorrhagic fever for which there is no known vaccine or cure. Narrators note, think of how easy it would be to find a signal of smallpox in people that were transfected with perhaps a phage. And once people are diagnosed, perhaps using some microarray test, which identifies that there's signs of smallpox, the claim can then be made that what people are dealing with is contagious or communicable. And then the actions can be taken based upon the concern that it's communicable. However, as this shows, read it again, but what was initially diagnosed as smallpox turned out to be the sort of hybrid that Audiobook and the Soviets had been developing, a combination of smallpox and the Marburg virus. Though not highly contagious, Marburg causes a hemorrhagic fever for which there is no known vaccine or cure. The terrorist trick, according to its designers, was to present policymakers with a recombinant virus that would express itself in distinct phases. The law enforcement and public health officials who had raced to the affected region to contain and treat the smallpox outbreak would themselves become the unwitting vectors of a secondary epidemic of deadly Marburg after they returned to their own communities. Think of how easy it would be once these first responders, the emergency responders, are collected and moved around to subject them to then something else to fulfill this projected narrative. Continuing on, the scenario, Haseltine assured the White House staff members, was scientifically plausible. He said, you could make such a virus today. In fact, any trained molecular biologist with a really good lab could do it, unquote. Narrator's note sort of reminds me of Dr. Robert Wallace Malone, who says that anyone with a basic degree and a garage could manufacture a horrifying gain-of-function biological weapon. Other experts later disagreed with Haseltine, dismissing the scenario as science fiction. John W. Huggins, the head of viral therapies at the Army lab at Fort Detrick, thought that using an exotic virus made sense, since the exercise was intended to stretch the nation's biological warfare preparedness system to its limits. But he, John W. Huggins, cautioned that the scientists were not even close to being able to manufacture such a diabolical weapon. The hybrid weapon envisioned in the exercise was many years away. Whatever its scientific plausibility, the results of the drill were not encouraging. While officials playing the role of state and local officials eventually managed, with great difficulty and after thousands of casualties, to bring the smallpox epidemic under control, they were flabbergasted when their ostensible victory over smallpox evaporated. They soon realized that they lacked the knowledge, resources, and stamina to contain or treat a secondary outbreak of Marburg or any deadly disease. After only a couple hours of role-playing, the administration officials pretending to be state and local officials were overwhelmed by the demands of thousands of hypothetically sick and dying people. Local medical offices rapidly exhausted their stocks of antibiotics and vaccines. Federal quarantine laws turned out to be too antiquated to deal with the rapidly spreading epidemic, and no state had adequate plans to take care of the people it had isolated. Officials did not know where to store and bury the still contaminated dead. What began as a domestic disaster became an international crisis as the epidemic threatened to spread into Mexico. Discovering huge gaps in logistics, legal authority, and medical care, officials began quarreling amongst themselves and with Washington over how to stem the epidemic. No one seemed to be in charge. The hush of defeat fell over the room. More narrator's notes. This leads, talking about the federal government being overwhelmed and the states needing more guidance, to a book that was written in 2000 and updated in 2001 called Public Health Law, Power, Duty, and Restraint by Lawrence O. Gostin, or Larry Gostin. Larry Gostin is really the author of something called the State Model Emergency Powers Act, which is a template which states can use to guide their response for serious emergencies such as this. Larry Gostin, by the way, is a top co-author of Michael Osterholm. Look at how many books and documents Michael Osterholm, author of Living Terrors, What America Needs to Know to Survive the Coming Bioterrorist Catastrophe. They co-authored extensively. Michael Osterholm was one of the very first people to comment in a United States newspaper about the possibility of anthrax or other biological terror agents on the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, as captured in a New York newspaper. Michael Osterholm is still with us and was a part of the COVID-19 response and narrative control. Larry Gostin at Georgetown University has someone reporting to him named Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz, whose work on Yellow Rain was also highlighted in this book. And Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz's family is so close to this Fauci family that they even use the word Fauci as a verb. And Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz was the person who in COVID-19 first shared with the United States population in interviews that the United States had just received someone from Wuhan on January 17th, 18th of 2000 that was showing signs of a flu, which could have been very similar to coronavirus. In other words, Snohomish County man. This State Emergency Powers Act was not being drawn up because international flights or long domestic flights were being hijacked by terrorists with box cutters. They were being drawn up because there was a concern about terrorism or terrorists using biological agents such as anthrax and spreading them on crowds using crop dusters. And what are we going to do to control the spread of the disease and design vaccines which can work, especially because we can't make the old vaccines fast enough or they're too dangerous or something. We're going to need gene therapy. How convenient that so many people related to the Human Genome Project also seem to be so concerned about the possibility of a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center and the response to it, and are still with us today, controlling the narrative of COVID-19.
Discovering huge gaps in logistics, legal authority, and medical care, officials began quarreling among themselves and with Washington over how to stem the epidemic. No one seemed to be in charge. The hush of defeat fell over the room.
In March, Secretary Cohen announced that the Pentagon would assume a much more direct role in domestic defense. Speaking to reporters at the National Press Club, he said the National Guard was creating 10 rapid reaction teams that would rush to an American city, town, or village attacked by chemical or biological weapons. The units, or RAID teams, RAID, an acronym standing for Rapid Assessment and Initial Detection, would be trained to detect chemicals or germs and organize the initial flow of federal and military assistance. Guard officers would provide crucial early help to local authorities overwhelmed by the task of treating the sick and wounded. The March 17, 1998 speech was vintage Cohen, quoting the poets T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, and Seamus Heaney, as well as Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military theorists. Cohen paraphrased Winston Churchill as he summed up the dangers of the new biology, saying, "We can return to the Stone Age on the gleaming wings of science just as quickly as we can glide into the 21st century." The Defense Secretary did make one error of scientific fact, asserting that a person could die from inhaling a single spore of anthrax. In fact, the fatal dose is several thousand spores. Afterward, a reporter asked whether the Pentagon truly saw an imminent danger of germ attack against civilians. Training the reserves for biological defense was a serious step. Almost a code red, said the reporter. 25 nations had or were developing chemical and biological weapons, Cohen replied, and the expertise was spreading rapidly through the internet and other means. Terrorist groups were also likely to acquire germ or chemical weapons in the coming years. "We have the finest military in the world," he said, "the best equipped, best educated, and most capable in American history. Few, if any, countries dared to challenge the United States directly. Foes would be searching for vulnerabilities to exploit." He said, "We have to be prepared. This is not a scare tactic. It's a reality, and we're likely to see more of it in the future." The story behind Cohen's announcement that day was more politics than poetry. Whatever the ultimate truth of Cohen's assessment, and it was not universally embraced, germ defense had become yet another prize in the quest for federal dollars by government agencies and Beltway consultants. The National Guard could call on some influential political allies both in Washington and in state capitals. It had the support of the nation's 50 governors and a network of members in every congressional district. In the mid-1990s, the National Guard was fighting to protect its turf as the post-Cold War military shrank. The Guard's relationship with the Army was acrimonious. Guard officials believed they had been given short shrift when the military services drew up the long-term planning document called the Quadrennial Defense Review. Legislation was pending to give the Guard a seat on the Joint Chiefs, a proposal that stirred anxiety among the other branches of the United States military. Cohen and his aides were eager to integrate the reserves more closely with the active duty force. In the fall of 1997, the National Guard supporters on Capitol Hill added $10 million to the defense spending bill that would define the Guard's role in the fight against chemical or biological terrorism. Soon after, the Guard awarded $7.5 million of that money to Science Applications International Cooperation, which had helped Congress for the appropriation, and that's SAIC. SAIC was already working for the government on biodefense issues and was, among other things, advising the Pentagon on managing the Michigan vaccine facility. Cohen believed that the Guard should have a place in domestic defense. The citizen soldiers reported to the governors and were trained to work with local authorities on disaster relief. They were, he would often say, forward deployed in the United States. Cohen's aides were already reviewing how the Guard and reserves would fit into the military's domestic defenses against chemical or biological attack. It did not want to get corralled into a huge new spending program by Congress. In January, just as SAIC was beginning its study, a team of Pentagon officials recommended 54 raid units, one for each state and territory. Cohen cut the number to 10. The Guard, he told aides, should learn to walk before it ran. Lawmakers lavished money on the new program. When the Pentagon asked for 5 more raid teams, Congress provided money for an additional 12. The SAIC study was eventually delivered to lawmakers. Crammed with colorful charts and graphs, it listed 47 potential new roles for the Guard. The study was quietly shelved.
On April 10, 1998, Clark summoned 7 of the nation's most distinguished scientists and public health experts to make their case for biodefense directly to President Clinton. It was the culmination of the planning that Clinton spurred after his dinner with Venter. One of the first experts Venter had recruited for the advisory group was Josh Lederberg, who doubted that a meeting with the president would do any good. "Be careful when you dance with elephants," Lederberg had warned him. The other invited experts were Lucille Shapiro, a Stanford University microbiologist, Barbara H. Rosenberg, an authority on the Biological Weapons Treaty, Thomas P. Monath, a vaccine researcher and former head of the Army's Biodefense Lab, and Jerome M. Hauer, New York City's head of emergency management. The delegation was led by Frank Young, who had retired from his emergency preparedness post at HHS and become a pastor.
And here we're going to add some additional notes and images from the narrator.
So we've showed this photo many times, and this is the event that the book is speaking of. It is this April 10th, 1998 event. Dick Clark's staff summoned 7 of the nation's most distinguished scientists and public health experts to make their case for biodefense directly to President Clinton. So you can see President Clinton there. So next to President Clinton is Donna Shalala, Director of Health and Human Services, basically the role that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is in right now. Now, we know that for the next year or two, Donna Shalala played a big part in encouraging additional funding for a new Center of Excellence for the United States military to be created in a small rural area in Pennsylvania, where there was this facility called the Winber Medical Center, which mostly provided hospice care. It's a rural area in a relatively impoverished region. Not too far from Johnstown, though, which does have a regional campus for the University of Pennsylvania or University of Pittsburgh. This Center of Excellence was going to be connected with Walter Reed, perhaps the only Center of Excellence that Walter Reed would have to track and observe breast cancer data, which, for some odd reason, they were concerned might be escalating or could significantly escalate over the next few years. Interesting that if the United States military was asked to take an experimental vaccine, such as new era of gene therapy vaccines for anthrax, because the Michigan factory was shut down, and maybe in response to a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center, that the United States military would have all of its cancer data backed up and made accessible through this Center of Excellence in Winber, Pennsylvania, which, oddly enough, was only about 10 miles where Flight 93 definitely did not crash, but which is officially nonetheless seen as the crash in Shanksville. And it's also a medical center that Dr. Robert Wallace Malone and his wife, Jill Glasspool Malone, were hired by the United States Uniformed Health Services to set up the computer operations and IT infrastructure of that laboratory, and then even train the new director of that laboratory, Richard Somiari, and a fresh-off-the-boat Nigerian immigrant who didn't even have his PhD completed yet, to be the scientific director of that laboratory, which was going to be the only center of excellence for the United States Army, connected with Walter Reed, and be attaining copies of all of this cancer data of the United States military. They were also testing vaccines involving peptides, something that the book also just mentioned recently. And yes, Donna Shalala was very eager in supporting that endeavor. Directly across the table from Bill Clinton is Dr. Joshua Lederberg. Two over to his left is Barbara Hatch Rosenberg, the person who said that
not long after the anthrax letters, that Stephen Hatfill should be a person of interest and someone who is should be considered as possibly connected or responsible for the anthrax letters.
So the initial person that was claimed to be responsible for the anthrax letters, whether he was or wasn't, I have no freaking idea. The person that said he did it was Barbara Hatch Rosenberg right there. Second to the right of Dr. Joshua Lederberg is Craig Venter, who's heavily covered, obviously, in this book. Was also awarded, along with Francis Collins, by Bill Clinton in
2000.
At an event in the White House that Kevin McKernan, I believe Kevin McKernan's dad as well, were both invited to. Kevin McKernan's dad just made tens or probably $100 million by a company, Packard Biosciences, which was just purchased, which just went public and then was purchased by Perkin-Elmer Corporation and so on and so forth, which then gets sucked up into Applied, etc., because they were developing a microarray technology would have enabled rapid detection of pathogens. Perfect if there was a large-scale biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center and you needed to identify which strains were there. Next to him is Jerry Hauer. Now, Jerry Hauer just happened to show up in the early afternoon on the Peter Jennings Show on September 11th, 2001 in a well-pressed suit. Let's see what he said on that day.
Type of an incident here in the city.
The Office of Emergency Management Office, that bunker, it's a pretty elegant bunker, and nor is it underground. It was
September 11th, 2001.
Right. I think. That's out of operation at the moment.
Yeah, my understanding
That's
is...
something you never planned for.
Yeah, well, in fact, we did. The alternate was to go to police headquarters or to another location in the event that the command center was inactivated for some reason or rendered useless.
Do you know what has happened to it today? Do you know precisely what's happened to it?
I talked to some folks down there, and my understanding is that a lot of the debris has fallen and has blocked the access to the building. I've heard some reports that they're concerned about the structural stability of the building. but I have not been able to confirm that. But as part of our plan, there were backups. You always have backups in your planning, and that's what the city is doing today.
Now, you've had to walk to get here today, and that's perfectly understandable. We're on the west side of Manhattan, and things are that difficult. But do you have a sense of how it's going? And we've heard the mayor's appraisal and accepted as an honest one. Do you have any sense of how the system's working, and do you have any sense of how many people are still trapped or dead?
Well, first of all, I think that things are working as they should. I think that, when you've got the best police and fire department anywhere in the world, they are doing everything to try and rescue people, to try and get near the building. But you've got to also realize the dynamics in a situation like this change a bit when you have a number of police and firefighters injured as well. Sure. And that's what we saw this morning. I was listening to the fire radio this morning when the building collapsed, and they were screaming for help because firefighters were trapped. So the emotion changes a bit, but these are extremely professional people. These are very heroic people. They will do everything they can to try and get in and rescue anybody that could potentially be alive in that building, recognizing that there is a potential for additional collapse.
John Podesta was also at this event. Of course he was. He was a science advisor for Bill Clinton. Getting back to this photo here. So that's Jerry Hauer. Next to Jerry Hauer, this is Thomas Monath, M-O-N-A-T-H. Now, Thomas Monath was already mentioned in his book. He's a curious fellow. He's been involved in infectious diseases in the military for a long time. At the time of the West Nile outbreak, there were concerns that there was a conflict of interest because he just happened to have a vaccine ready to go for that, and that was in 1999 or 2000. But it's also noteworthy that Thomas Monath became a key person with respect to metabiota. That's right. A person who went on to work with Peter Daszak and Nathan Wolfe is also at the table regarding concerns of a biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center in 1998, a few seats over from none other than Joshua Lederberg. And Thomas Monath went on to work at Newlink Corporation, Newlink Genetics, in the year 2013, 2014 or so, because they just happened to recently acquire an Ebola vaccine candidate from the PHAC, the Public Health Agency Canada, for a mere $200,000. And then when that Ebola outbreak hit West Africa in 2014 or so, the United States Defense Threat Reduction Agency, that's right, the agency that was partially co-founded by Andy Weber, who got his own chapter in this book, Germs, the DTRA put forth the money for that Ebola vaccine. And the candidate that they chose was the Ebola vaccine candidate,
Newlink Corporation,
which then recently hired just before then this Thomas Monath. And then the Defense Threat Reduction Agency encouraged Newlink Corporation and Thomas Monath to hire someone to shuttle back and forth that vaccine and the business details of it to a large company, Merck Corporation, to then manufacture that vaccine under emergency authorization. And that person was none other than Dr. Robert Wallace Malone. You know, the same Dr. Robert Wallace Malone who this book, Big Shot AIDS Vaccine, which we will definitely be reviewing next or very, very soon. Again, this book demonstrates that Robert Wallace Malone knew Nancy Hagwood, probably since 1989. The same Nancy Hagwood, who in 2007 went to the FBI and said that Bruce Ivins was a person who was suspicious and most likely capable, because of his past behavior, of being the lone wolf responsible for the anthrax letters. In other words, among the people who's most likely to know the actual identity of the anthrax letter mailer, very, very high on that list is Robert Wallace Malone, who is currently officially, or probably not officially, but realistically, a top advisor of all of the United States Health and Human Services via Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Jay Bhattacharya, who, according to Jonathan Cooey, Gigahome Biological, requested one thing and one thing only from Jonathan Cooey. And you know what that was? To not name Dr. Robert Wallace Malone anymore in his show. It appears as though Robert Wallace Malone is a key person in understanding September 11th, 2001, or the potential large-scale biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center, which would have resulted in a new era of gene therapy vaccines, such as from Vical Corporation, being rolled out on first the United States military. Data which would have been tracked and collected via Winber, where Robert Wallace Malone was setting up the IT infrastructure. And I'm a little bit feisty right now, because if it wasn't for the fact that everyone's avoiding the most important books and distracting and leading people down paths to nowhere, thousands or hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people in the United States of America right now could actually be revisiting and understanding the nature of the events and the seriousness of this drive for the advancement of gene therapy, but more importantly, the mastery and control of knowledge of the human genome. It's right there. All you need to do is read the real books. Ignore that stupid 9/11 report. Most of it's omitted, is blanked out anyways. But we have the real books, which foreshadowed all of this, and they're available to you. They're still out there. They can never be erased. All they can do is drowned out. That's the only thing that the narrative controllers can do, is to put more and more and more baloney out there and nonsense and BS, so you feel as though you shouldn't be looking at the things that matter. I have nothing new to add to this. I'm merely collecting the evidence which is scattered about, but everyone has been discouraged from looking at. We're going to review this past, we're going to go back 30 seconds in the book and replay that past paragraph.
On April 10, 1998, Clark summoned 7 of the nation's most distinguished scientists and public health experts to make their case for biodefense directly to President Clinton. It was the culmination of the planning that Clinton spurred after his dinner with Venter. One of the first experts Venter had recruited for the advisory group was Josh Lederberg, who doubted that a meeting with the president would do any good. "Be careful when you dance with elephants," Lederberg had warned him. The other invited experts were Lucille Shapiro, a Stanford University microbiologist, Barbara H. Rosenberg, an authority on the Biological Weapons Treaty, Thomas P. Monath, a vaccine researcher and former head of the Army's Biodefense Lab, and Jerome M. Hauer, New York City's head of emergency management. The delegation was led by Frank Young, who had retired from his emergency preparedness post at HHS and become a pastor. Originally, the list of invitees had also included 3 other experts, among them Brad Roberts, a research staff member of the Institute for Defense Analysis. Roberts, a seasoned Washington military analyst, was rather more skeptical than some of the other invitees about whether states or terrorists would be able or willing to use germ weapons to kill masses of people anytime soon. He planned to highlight the inherent obstacles to the use of such germ agents and to put what he termed some balance into the debate about how serious a threat bioweapons posed and how much the United States ought to spend to counter it. But days before the meeting, a member of Clark's staff called him and 2 other invitees to say their invitations were being rescinded. There was so much cabinet-level interest in the experts' meeting that there was not enough room for all of the outsiders. Since Clinton had requested a small session, some experts had to be taken off the list. They were very sorry, the official added. Maybe Roberts could attend a future meeting with the president.
Though they differed on the likelihood of a germ attack in the near future, the invitees all agreed that the United States had dangerously neglected its public health system. An audience with President Bill Clinton, they felt, was the chance of a lifetime. No president had ever been more predisposed to understand their pleas. The scientists saw America's vulnerability to germ attacks as an extreme example of the country's pervasive failure to deal with infectious diseases. persuading President Bill Clinton to increase spending on public health would help millions of Americans, even if no one ever tried to attack America with germs. Compared with the healthcare in other economically developed states, the United States public health system was a disaster. Almost half of all local health departments did not have the use of email. At least 100,000 of them had no access to any online or internet service. 20% of them still had rotary phones. Ralph D. Morris, the president of the National Association of Country and City Health Officials, had warned Congress in 1998 that 70% of health directors had little or no expertise in using computer services.
Almost half of all local health departments did not have the use of email. At least 1,000 of them had no access to any online or internet service. 20% of them still had rotary phones. Some local health departments could not even afford a microscope, much less sophisticated computer technology. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's epidemic surveillance system, created a half-century earlier to detect germ warfare attacks, was in tatters. Most epidemiological investigators and even emergency room physicians were unlikely to recognize a case of anthrax, a rare disease. Nor would they correctly diagnose a patient with smallpox, which had theoretically been eradicated. The meeting was scheduled for the Cabinet Room in the White House. President Clinton apologized in advance for seeming a little slow that morning. He had been up most of the night mediating between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republican Army to avoid the collapse of the peace process, and had gotten only an hour or two of sleep. Behind the experts was a ring of chairs occupied by cabinet officials and their top aides, among them Defense Secretary Cohen, Attorney General Janet Reno, Health and Human Services Secretary Donna E. Shalala, Director of Central Intelligence George J. Tenet, National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, and Dick Clark. According to notes of the meeting provided by a participant and interviews with all the experts, Clinton told the group that he had become increasingly worried about the dangers of the new biological era.
The ability to sequence and manipulate genes had profound implications for national security and for traditional strategies aimed at defending the nation against unconventional attacks. Because rogue states and terrorists could now manipulate genes, he said, offense may be getting ahead of defense.
Nuclear weapons were expensive and relatively easy to detect, he said. Biological weapons were neither. Germs were a low-rent way to be a big player. Iraq's resistance to relinquishing its biological weapons program, for instance, showed that Saddam Hussein obviously placed a huge value on not giving it up. Iraq had forfeited tens of billions of dollars in oil revenues to retain its germ warfare agents and expertise.
Recombinant biotechnology created the possibility not only of new treatments for age-old diseases, but also of new threats, Clinton said. What was their assessment of Richard Preston's book titled The Cobra Event? Was the plot a forecast of what's in our future? Was it scientifically plausible? Several of the experts said later that while they personally doubted that any scientist could conduct such a terrorist strike, they stayed silent at the meeting. Others told the president that yes, such an attack was possible. Steering the conversation away from the novel, Joshua Lederberg said that any terrorist attack involving an infectious agent, be it naturally derived or genetically modified, would be, in his deliberate understatement, a very serious event.
Lederberg detailed the importance of scientific breakthroughs in the history of war, the dramatic results when offensive capabilities had outstripped defensive measures. The introduction of iron weapons, for instance, had made bronze weapons ineffective. Gunpowder had made the defensive armor of medieval knights obsolete. Horses and cavalries had enabled Asians to sweep through Europe. And now the offensive capability of germs as bioweapons seemed to be outstripping defenses against them. Germs, he said, were strategic weapons that could strike deep into the nation's heartland. Such attacks could be attempted by states, terrorist groups they supported, or lone actors. Individuals can make war with these new weapons, Lederberg warned. To counter such attacks, antiviral drugs and therapeutics were needed. So were new vaccines based on new technologies. Shapiro, a colleague of Lederberg's from Stanford, outlined the new possibilities offered by recombinant technology. To illustrate the awesome powers of new genetically manipulated germs, she described to the president how natural selection created new antibiotic-resistant microbes. What bugs do naturally, she said, was worrisome enough. Federal money was desperately needed to help science combat emerging new diseases, whatever their origin.
Shapiro reminded the administration officials of the Russian article on bioengineered anthrax.
Much of the government's support for research over the past 20 years had been spent on fighting heart disease and cancer. The NIH, she told Clinton and the others, had not been given sufficient resources to study pathogens and understand how they operated, or to do other basic antibiotic and antiviral research. Microbiology in general had been underfinanced. The bugs are smarter than we are, she declared, and the bugs are winning. Venter pushed hard for federal support for genetic sequencing and gene identification. The techniques were crucial, he argued, to detecting germs and designing drugs against new strains of ancient scourges, tuberculosis among others. Scientists needed these genetic codes to protect the country. Recombinant technology was rapidly spreading for good and evil, he warned. Even high school students were now genetically engineering bacteria and viruses. Hauer, New York's emergency management director, outlined measures that the city had adopted to respond more effectively to a germ weapons attack. To detect sudden shifts in the health of its population, New York City now monitored not only daily admissions to hospital emergency rooms and the deaths of young or unlikely victims of mysterious ailments, but also less obvious public health indicators such as sales of kaopectate and other over-the-counter drugs used to treat diarrhea. He had also designated close to 300 facilities as pods, or points of distribution, for antibiotics and drugs in a crisis. He had selected Madison Square Garden and the Jacob K. Javits Convention Center for emergency care facilities where people could be treated if the city's hospitals were filled. New York had taught thousands of doctors, nurses, police, firemen, and other emergency personnel what to do and what not to do in responding to a chemical or germ attack. His department was planning to negotiate contingency agreements to buy drugs in huge quantities at affordable prices should the need arise. And yet, Hauer said, New York was still not prepared to respond to such an emergency. New York and other cities would desperately need federal assistance quickly to control unrest and to protect drugstores and hospitals that might be stormed as people sought antibiotics and vaccines for themselves and loved ones. And the federal government was still unable to provide timely help. Tom Manath, a vaccine specialist who had joined a private vaccine company after a distinguished government career, stressed the need for new vaccines, antibiotics, and other antidotes to respond to infections from classical germs and genetically modified agents. He called Clinton's attention to a touchy issue, the limits on research spurred by an overly strict adherence to the Biological Weapons Treaty. Many scientists, he asserted, were reluctant to conduct important research because they feared that it could be seen as part of a biological weapons program and thus a violation of the treaty. Manath said the government had underfunded vaccine research. The nation needed a vaccine for Ebola, for instance, but even the military said it could not afford to develop one. The private sector would not do this work because it was not profitable.
Remember, this is a September 7th, 2001, or September 9th, 2001 book. Speaking of Thomas, I say Monath, but the narrator says Moneth. Yes, he worked with Peter Daszak and C.J. Peters, and he was an advisor for Metabiota, so like a board member of sorts. But here we're talking about Ebola. It's noteworthy that, at least according to this article, a February 22nd, 2016 article from Chemical and Engineering News, or CNEN, titled Gearing Up to Fight Zika, researchers scramble to develop tools and treatments to combat the mosquito-borne virus. And the key person in this article is Thomas Monath. It reads, other scientists are working to develop a vaccine against Zika virus. Early this month, 2016, President Barack Obama said he would ask Congress for $1.8 billion to combat Zika at home and abroad. Of those funds, $200 million would be used for vaccine development, etc. Next paragraph. Even so, it could take 3 to 5 years before a vaccine is ready for Zika, experts say. Thomas Monath, the chief science officer of Newlink Genetics Corporation, Infectious Disease Division, led that firm's effort to develop an Ebola vaccine and was CSO at Acambus.
The point
here is that effectively 13 years after the Judith Miller book was written, Germs, and a book which is talking about Thomas Monath and says the nation needed a vaccine for Ebola, according to him, it was none other than him, 13 or 14 years later, him, that went on to be hired by Newlink Corporation and provide the first licensed or FDA-approved Ebola vaccine. I mean, talk about getting lucky. Talk about hitting it out of the park. Also noteworthy is that other names in this article regarding the Zika vaccine includes, and the quote is, "We're basically starting from scratch on this one, unfortunately," says Sina Bavari, Chief Science Officer, CSO at USAMRIID, United States Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases. The Zika vaccine worked on extensively by Sina Bavari, along with other Robert Malone associates, including David Hone and Heinz Feldman.
Barbara Rosenberg, the group's specialist on the treaty banning biological weapons, told Clinton that he would have to place greater priority on negotiating a protocol to enforce the treaty if he wanted to stop the spread of germ weapons. American leadership was desperately needed if progress at the Geneva talks was to be made. The American pharmaceutical industry was opposed to demands for routine inspections of its plants, fearing industrial espionage and loss of trade secrets. However, the companies had accepted the idea of challenge inspections, spot checks that would be conducted if a country was charged with specific violations of the treaty. The drug makers' doubts could be assuaged by meaningful consultation with government officials, Rosenberg argued. Without such arrangements and adequate verification, she warned, the treaty was toothless. Clinton frequently interrupted the brief presentations, firing off questions to the experts and his cabinet. How long would it take for the nation to develop the technology needed to quickly identify and diagnose deadly pathogens? Who was doing such research and where? Was such work being coordinated by anyone in the government, in the private sector? If a terrorist let something loose inside an airport, how long would it take the government to figure out that the nation had been attacked, and how long after that to identify the agent? And finally, what about money? How much would an adequate defense cost? The cost would be high, the group agreed, adding that it would soon provide the president with specific proposals and cost estimates.
As the meeting ended, Joshua Lederberg gave Clinton a copy of the August 1997 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was devoted entirely to the threat of germ weapons and bioterrorism. Sounds like we need that one. Lederberg had edited the issue and written its lead editorial. The issue also featured an article by CDC scientists that described for the first time the full epidemiological story behind the Rajneesh's salmonella attack in Oregon, and that's back in the early 1980s and covered in Chapter 1 of this book. 13 years after the event, in the wake of the sarin gas incident in Tokyo, the investigation had finally decided to give a fuller account of the incident. The benefits of wider public discussion, they felt, now outweighed the risks of inspiring a copycat. Clinton read the articles and circulated the scholarly journal to his staff a few days later with his handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. Told of Clinton's attention by a White House staffer, Joshua Lederberg smiled. It was surely the first time a president had ever read an entire issue of the medical journal. While President Clinton told his staff that he found the meeting very useful, the session was not without its critics. Within days, experts who had not been invited complained that several participants had used the gathering to promote personal agendas. Craig Venter's call for increased spending on gene sequencing drew some heat. His nonprofit institute was already receiving millions of dollars in federal support, and some viewed his presentation on the value of his work as special pleading. Venter dismissed the criticism, saying that his federal money came through grants that were competitively awarded by expert panels on the basis of scientific merit and not lobbying. His institute, for example, had recently won a grant to sequence the cholera microbe, a deadly pathogen. Craig Venter did have a broader commercial interest in the techniques he was developing. When the experts gathered at the White House, he was already preparing a for-profit venture called Celera, C-E-L-E-R-A. The new company planned to beat a federally funded group in the race to decode the human genome. Venter wanted his company to be among the first to realize the commercial potential of that breakthrough. Participants in the meeting and some White House officials said they were also troubled by Thomas Monath's potential conflict of interest. Monath was widely admired within scientific and government circles for his work at both the Army lab at Fort Detrick and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. As a tropical disease specialist, he had repeatedly risked his life fighting epidemics around the world. But most of those present said they had no idea that his struggling vaccine company called Oravax was trying to win a Pentagon subcontract to make smallpox vaccine. After a New York Times story disclosed his financial interest, colleagues rushed to Monath's defense. Monath, they said, had devoted his life to public service. The White House meeting was about domestic defense, and Monath's company was seeking a contract to make vaccine for the military and not civilians. Monath said he had disclosed his company's financial interests to White House officials.
On May 6, Frank Young, the moderator of the experts group, sent the president a 17-page report summarizing its unanimous recommendations. The report, which was not made public, concluded that all levels of government were woefully unprepared for a bioweapons attack. It recommended focusing on two areas: the use of new genetic engineering techniques to develop better antibiotics and vaccines, and a plan for reducing civilian casualties if a dangerous pathogen was deliberately released. The document included a separate section suggesting ways in which the proposed protocol to the treaty banning germ weapons should be strengthened. Finally, it urged the president to establish an advisory committee to set priorities and foster cooperation among the many government fiefdoms with sway over biodefense and public health.
The experts had been unsure how much money to request. At a gathering in a cloakroom just before the meeting, Young said the group dared not ask for more than $100 million a year, no matter how grave a threat they painted. Lederberg had strongly disagreed. It was not worth even taking up the president's time for that amount of money, he had argued. Moreover, $100 million annually would not begin to address the problem. Lederberg said the group should propose spending about $500 million a year for the next 4 to 5 years. That was a minimum, he asserted. Frank Young was staggered by the estimate. A veteran of many a federal budget battle, Young said the sum was too large, and others agreed. But Lederberg insisted on the larger figure. In Washington, serious business was defined by serious money.
The document Young submitted called for more than $1.9 billion in spending over the next 5 years, with a total of $420 million for national stockpiles of antibiotics and vaccines. This would be enough to provide 40 million doses of smallpox vaccine, which would reduce death and illness from a smallpox epidemic by 10 to 100-fold. The group called upon the government to invest $860 million in research to develop new antibiotics, antivirals, and vaccines, and to increase spending on the study and sequencing of genes, the molecular blueprints of microbes, and on diagnostic equipment to detect dangerous germs. Finally, the panel urged the president to spend $1.04 billion over 5 years to improve emergency responses to biological attack, with at least $170 million for the dilapidated public health system. One of the most politically delicate sections of the report had nothing to do with money. The document noted, for instance, that many of the experiments needed to study genetically manipulated organisms and to develop antibiotics and vaccines for them would not be permitted by Recombinant DNA Review Board and biosafety regulations in the United States. If such research were to be done anyway and the results were published, the research might well raise alarm on the part of other nations, as did the Russian report on anthrax resistant to vaccine. It might also provide recipes, the group warned, to those interested in using genetic engineering for nefarious purposes. The experts endorsed such defensive research and urged that it be conducted under the guidance of an objective review board composed of civilian scientists and public health specialists. Such a panel could oversee Pentagon research and programs that would otherwise not be approvable under current regulations. The report did not address the issue of how this could be done without tipping off possible adversaries to America's vulnerabilities. Without directly saying so, the panel seemed to be arguing that the existing restrictions on genetic research should be sidestepped in the interest of national security. Dangerous new recombinant organisms had to be studied, made, tested, even if such work pushed to the limits of what the Germ Warfare Treaty allowed in the name of defense. The results of the presidential audience were somewhat less than the experts had hoped. A little more than 25% of the funds Young requested was initially approved for the first year. To be sure, Clinton's rhetoric changed measurably. In May 1998, the president traveled to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis to present his plan for germ defense. "We must do more to protect our people," Clinton said. His speech touched all the bases. It urged the creation of a stockpile of vaccines and antibiotics for the first time in the nation's history. It said strengthening the treaty banning germ weapons was a major priority. It committed money to support basic research into deadly pathogens. It reflected Venter's influence by stressing the potential importance of decoding the human genome in designing new antibiotics. And it promised money to upgrade the nation's public health clinics to aid our preparedness against terrorism and to help us cope with infectious diseases that arise in nature. "We must not cede the cutting edge of biotechnology to those who would do us harm," the president told the cheering cadets. The president also signed a new executive order, Presidential Decision Directive 62, creating a White House office to coordinate the government's programs in security, infrastructure protection, and counterterrorism. The job of counterterrorism czar went to Dick Clark, greatly expanding his responsibilities. But the applause of the naval cadets had barely subsided when the resistance began, at home and abroad. Faced with unanticipated skepticism about the president's sweeping initiatives from both his own agencies and outsiders, the administration began trimming its pledges. In June, Clinton asked Congress for $294 million to finance all of the experts' proposals. While the group recommended spending $200 million to build a stockpile of vaccines and antibiotics, the White House initially requested $41 million. Less than a month later, the White House decided against spending any money at all to buy vaccines that year. More effective, cheaper vaccines might be available in 2 to 3 years, administration officials said. It was better to wait.
Some narrator's notes here.
So this next paragraph is going to mention a couple of names that we have to introduce. The first one is Mark Zaid. Mark Zaid, born 1967, is an American attorney with a practice focused on national security law, freedom of speech, constitutional claims, and government accountability. In 1998, he founded the James Madison Project, an organization dedicated to reducing government secrecy. Okay. So far, so good. At least at the brochure level. It is interested in the Freedom of Information Act and government whistleblowers. Born in New York City, went to University of Rochester. Through his practice, Mark Zaid often represents former or current federal government employees, intelligence officers, and whistleblowers who gave grievances against agencies of the United States government or foreign governments. Additionally, he represents members of the media and the public in First Amendment and FOIA and FOI/PA disputes. Some of his cases are well known, such as suing Libya for the 1998 terrorist bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. Zaid had been quoted in print and online news reports as an expert in national security law and FOIA law. He appeared as a commentator on CNN and MSNBC. In February 2020, federal officials indicted a Michigan man for threatening Zaid and his Ukraine whistleblower client. That's right. He was a member of the legal team led by Andrew Baca, representing the whistleblower a complaint against President Donald Trump that sparked a major political scandal and led to the launching of an impeachment inquiry against President Trump. Mark Zaid had been critical of Trump long before he began representing the whistleblower. He said the team is also working on a second whistleblower who has spoken to authorities but had not filed a formal complaint. He was also involved in the D.B. Cooper case. So multiple cases against President Trump. Which the reason why Mark Zaid is being brought up in the book here is that it's my understanding that Mark Zaid represented United States military personnel that refused the anthrax vaccines. Now, I can make comments for whatever they're worth about the safety of the traditional vaccine and the newer vaccines, which might have been around the corner, and so on and so forth. I have full compassion for any military personnel that didn't want to take any of these. So their refusal and their defense by Mark Zaid is fine. And this goes on, and the book goes on to say it. However, the other scientist that comes into play here, and it's almost too hard to believe, but the other scientist that comes into play here, who put forward suggestions that perhaps the anthrax vaccine was a no-gooda, was Merrill Nass. Merrill Nass and Mark Zaid collaborated to some extent. I don't know how much they worked together. I won't say that they were on the phone together a lot, but they were both involved in suggesting that military personnel should not have to take anthrax vaccines. Now, in Merrill Nass's case, NASS, and again, Merrill Nass has been was the number 2 science officer at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s Children's Health Defense. Merrill Nass also made attempts to make sure I stopped talking about Robert Malone. And Merrill Nass and Robert Malone were both involved in the ethical review of testing anthrax vaccines on children as a phone call from the year, I think it was 2011. Merrill Nass is an enthusiastic supporter of Robert Malone. Huge, huge, huge hug on the floor just before Robert F. Kennedy took the stage and announced that he was running for president in Boston. I was there. I have it on videotape. Mark Zaid also, along with Merrill Nass, and you could find United States Department of Justice documents, and they may not be true, but it's true that they are printed, that say that 2 of the top voices in suggesting that Bruce Ivins probably could have been responsible for those anthrax letters included Mark Zaid and Merrill Nass. So with that said, let's begin this next section here, which was mostly omitted by the Amazon Audible audiobook. The Pentagon began vaccinating the troops in the Middle East against anthrax in March 1998, before William Cohen gave his final approval to the program. General Zinni, that's Zinni, the regional commander, told Washington he saw an imminent threat from Iraq and could not wait any longer. Most servicemen took their shots, but more than 24 sailors aboard the Navy carriers USS John C. Stennis and the USS Independence refused, fearing the immunizations could harm their health. The Navy moved to discipline the sailors for disobeying a direct order, and several asked for help from Mark S. Zaid, a Washington-based lawyer who made a name for himself challenging the government in national security cases. Mark Zaid's clients already included Patrick G. Eddington and Robin Eddington, a husband and wife team who worked for the CIA and contended that their agency had covered up evidence about Gulf War syndrome. Taking advantage of the new technology available aboard ships, several of the sailors had emailed Eddington with their concerns about the vaccine program. He passed their messages on to Mark Zaid. A slender, kinetic young lawyer with a knack for obtaining documents through the Freedom of Information Act, Zaid was a government bureaucracy's worst nightmare. His solo practice was eclectic. He was one of the lawyers suing Libya for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988, and he had a continuing interest in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Mark Zaid had amassed a thick file of reporters' phone numbers and had learned how to frame a story to give it a broad appeal. When the first sailors began to call, Zaid, barely 30 years old, encouraged their mothers to be interviewed by the press. Mark Zaid explained, "The generals can yell at me, but they can't yell at them." At first, Mark Zaid saw little grounds for a legal challenge. The anthrax vaccine appeared to be fully approved by the FDA, and the Navy's orders to take it seemed proper. Still, Zaid felt he needed to learn a great deal more. He filed a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act for every document relating to the program. Government programs, he knew, usually looked different from the inside. Pentagon officials were optimistic about the prospects for the program and for the Michigan vaccine facility. It had finally been sold to Bioport, a new company whose partners included Admiral William J. Crowe, Jr., the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Bioport did have some experience in the vaccine field. Its chief executive, Fuad El-Hibri, had already converted a British government vaccine plant into a successful private venture. Still, there were some worrying signs about the Michigan lab's prospects. A February 1998 inspection by the FDA reported that while some of the deficiencies in the scathing 1996 review had been corrected, numerous problems remained. The inspectors found shortcomings in almost every phase of the production process, suggesting that Bioport would have to come a long way before the regulators would be satisfied. I will add that this is Fuad El-Hibri, born 1958. He is, I think, routinely presented in books such as from the highly overrated researcher Whitney Webb as being a bad guy. Unfortunately, the poor dude died on May 5th, 2022. Fast-acting cancer. New York Times basically used his death as an opportunity to smear him. The article was titled, "Fuad El-Hibri, who led a troubled vaccine maker, dies at 64. His company, Emergent Biosolutions, won a lucrative contract to produce COVID vaccines, but then had to throw out millions of contaminated doses." So the New York Times hates him. Whitney Webb hates him. I suspect that this Germs book also doesn't like him either. Why do so many people hate this guy, even though he's dead? And by the way, his death was really only a couple of weeks after our son died. That's probably why I didn't notice it, of a drug overdose. Speaking of which, this company, Emergent Biosolutions, is the only manufacturer of Narcan, the drug which is used to restore life, if administered shortly after an overdose, to people who are in the process of dying of an opioid overdose, usually fentanyl overdose. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved by Emergent Biosolutions. Given the size of the company, its revenue and number of employees, I can make the case that they have saved more lives than any other pharma company per dollar than in the United States of America or perhaps the world. Yet for some reason, Whitney Webb hates them. The Times hates them. Obviously, this book, which comes out of New York Times editor, hate them. James Corbett probably hates them as well. Why do so many people hate this company? A person who hates this company is Meryl Nass. When I interviewed Meryl Nass, she criticized his company for making Narcan shots, forcing first responders to buy them for $50 a shot. What a bad company, Meryl Nass said. Meryl Nass, of course, a collaborator of the Mark Zaid, who we are now speaking about in this book, Germs.
In May 1998, 2 months after the military began vaccinating the troops in the Middle East, the go-ahead was given to proceed to the rest of the troops. The military began inoculating active duty troops around the world in August. Reservists were included in the initial round of vaccinations, but only if they spent more than 30 days in a high-threat area. Air National Guard pilots, who handle a significant number of the military's cargo flights into the Middle East while on weekend duty, were largely exempt from the shots since they only spend a few days in the region. By the summer of 1998, Pentagon officials were dealing with a new, potentially controversial question: how to structure the command for the Guard and other military units that would respond to a chemical or biological attack within the United States. John J. Hamre told NATO officials in late June that the Pentagon was considering whether to appoint a new regional commander to direct homeland defense within America's borders. "We don't believe we have primary responsibility, but within minutes of an event, people are going to turn to us," Hamre said. "If there is a biological attack, you can easily see regional governors calling out the National Guard to quarantine the highways. They could get crazy very fast." Pentagon officials saw a host of valuable roles for the Guard or reserve forces in the aftermath of a germ or chemical attack, from pitching tents to setting up field hospitals to burying the dead. The proposal alarmed civil liberties experts. A germ or chemical attack by terrorists would unleash chaos, and military units working with local authorities would be quickly pressed to maintain order, a mission for which they were not trained. Soon enough, soldiers would be arresting civilians. The United States has a long, proud history of restraining military operations on American soil. The Posse Comitatus Act, passed after the Civil War, bars federal troops from doing police work within U.S. borders. The New York Times editorialized against the plan for establishing a new command, saying it would erode the long-established legal principle that America's armed forces should not be involved in domestic law enforcement.
There's another big omission in the Amazon Audible audiobook here. The name Gregory T. Noheim, that's Nojeim. This sentence was skipped in the previous paragraph. The proposal alarmed civil liberties experts, and this is the proposal that came out of the Pentagon. Gregory T. Noheim, Legislative Counsel on National Security for the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington, felt the idea had been poorly thought through and posed a potentially serious danger to American freedom. It then goes on to talk about a germ or chemical attack by terrorists would unleash chaos. It also skips this paragraph. Pentagon officials said they did not want to supplant local police, and they pointed to the federal disaster response plans drawn up in 1995, which called for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to take the lead in managing the consequences of a terrorist attack. John Hamre invited Noheim to lunch at the Pentagon. The military, he said, would support FEMA and had no intention of overstepping bounds so deeply rooted in law and tradition.
Reacting to the criticism, the Pentagon scaled back the plan for Homeland Defense, reserving the command for a 2-star general drawn from the National Guard. Hamre felt the change would make a big difference. 4-star generals he had seen were a breed apart, treated like demigods by their subordinates and accustomed to giving orders that would be obeyed without question. A citizen soldier from the Guard would be much better equipped to understand America's civilian civil liberties culture. Critics were not mollified. Changing the rank of the commanding officer did not settle the question of how, precisely, the government would prevent the military from seizing control in the panicked hours after a terrorist assault. Popular fears about the issue were fanned by the movie The Siege, which came out in the fall of 1998. In the film, New York is attacked by a group of Arab terrorists, and a particularly obnoxious military officer, played by Bruce Willis, imposes martial law, rounds up American citizens, and puts them in barbed wire fenced camps. Pentagon officials dismissed the movie as utter fantasy, but it had resonance.
Hello, sir. It's Agent Hubbard, FBI. And what I propose is that you let these people go, and I'll take their place. I'm going to take your silence to mean that you're considering my offer.
Oh. Oh, God.
London, Belfast, Beirut. We're not the first city to have to deal with terrorism. This is New York City. We can take it.
You don't understand. These guys are pros. From the age of 12, they've been dodging people like you.
The situation is appalling. They're attacking our way of life. The president wants it stopped, and there's only one way to do that.
Are you saying the president is prepared to take the necessary steps?
expiration of the War Powers Act by the President, I am declaring a state of martial law in this city. We intend to seal off this borough, and we intend to squeeze it.
Do you have any idea what you're starting here?
It's wrong. What if what they really want is for us to herd children in the stadiums like we're doing? And put soldiers on the street and have Americans looking over their shoulders? Bend the law, shred the Constitution just a little bit. We do that, and everything that we have bled and fought and died for is over.
Don't you ever again question my command, is that clear? I'm not under your command, General. Take a look around, tell me if you really think that's true.
Can you believe that? So not only are people getting bombarded with videos about the things that we notice are the movies like Contagion, which came out on September 11th, 2011. Fun fact. Or concerns about the spreading viruses, etc. We've reviewed Andromeda Strain, which was late 1960s, etc. But there's other movies that play into this, such as this movie, The Siege. Fall of 1998, pre-9/11. This is key. New York is attacked by a group of Arab terrorists, and an obnoxious military officer played by Bruce Willis imposes martial law, rounds up American citizens, and puts them in barbed wire fence camps. So this movie is telling people how bad it would be if the United States military is used for police operations on United States soil. And clearly, they are seeding the paranoia about the military doing this. Not educating, they're seeding paranoia here before September 11th, 2001. Why? Cold rain came down in torrents at the White House on January 21st, 1999, as President Clinton discussed the threat that he said kept him awake at night. Not even nuclear or chemical weapons were as frightening as germ warfare, he told the New York Times reporters who had been invited to the Oval Office for the first interview he had given to a major U.S. newspaper in a year, since the Monica Lewinsky scandal had erupted. While a chemical attack would be horrible, he said, it would be finite. But a biological attack would spread through the land, particularly if its perpetrators unleashed a contagious agent that was not quickly identified and properly treated. A germ attack would be, as he put it, the gift that keeps on giving. Sounds like we need DNA microtechnology, such as from Packard Biosystems. In deciding to speak publicly about what he considered a growing danger to the United States, Clinton said he was trying to strike a balance between educating people and throwing them into unnecessary panic. He wanted Americans to know what they needed to know and have a realistic view of this, not to be afraid or asleep. I think that's the trick, he said. But he added that a serious attack or the threat of one is highly likely in the next few years, which is why the government was erecting defenses. President Clinton said, "We'll just deliberately work on this and do the very best we can." If he said that in 1998, I guess September 11th, 2001, or the fall of 2001 would be within the next few years on the money. How about that? If Clinton was preoccupied with the ongoing scandal that threatened his presidency, he showed no sign of it. Seated in a large wing chair in front of a fireplace, a portrait of George Washington staring down at him serenely, Clinton seemed relaxed but focused on the interview's agenda. The performance was impressive, perhaps even surreal, since at the very moment Clinton's lawyers were defending him at Senate impeachment proceedings on Capitol Hill. The White House itself was quieter than usual, most reporters and cameramen had flocked to the Hill for Senate debate. Clinton seemed eager to discuss something other than the Lewinsky scandal. Clinton seemed eager to discuss something other than the Lewinsky affair, every detail of which was being dissected on television and in the halls of Congress. He had clearly studied the biological issue and, echoing the views of Craig Venter and Joshua Lederberg, said he saw germ weapons as posing a unique threat to the nation's security. Defending against such dangers, President Clinton said, would tax the resources and creative powers of the military, law enforcement agencies, scientific research institutes, and the nation's ailing public health system. But it could and would be done. He recalled that as a boy, during the Cold War, he had lived in a world where protective shelters against radioactive fallout were common, and every school had its drills. Those steps were sensible at the time, he said, and now new threats to the nation demanded a new kind of civil defense. Clinton said, What I want us to do is everything within reason we can to minimize our exposure and risks here. For the American people, Clinton said, this push shouldn't be a cause for alarm but reassurance. They should want us to be well organized on these things. Yes, President Clinton said, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a blessing, but it was also a challenge. During the Cold War, the Soviets and Americans had been giants in straitjackets, deterred from using their unconventional weapons for fear of retaliation. But new enemies could now strike the United States with bioweapons without identifying themselves. People who dreamed of being martyrs were more than likely the Soviets to strike out at Americans, and deterrence would be more complicated if Russia's impoverished scientists sold their expertise or lethal germs to people who were more likely than the Soviets ever to use it. Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi sponsor of anti-American terrorism, had tried hard to acquire chemical weapons and may have tried to get germ weapons as well. This is the book nobody wants to mention. This is the book nobody reviews. This book. The terrorism President Clinton had already witnessed in his presidency, the growing number of hoaxes in which people claimed to have dispersed anthrax. There had been 12 the previous month in California alone, and the numerous intelligence reports he had read had convinced him that it was highly likely that a terrorist group would launch or threaten a germ or chemical attack on American soil within the next few years. He said his administration would have to do more to bolster the nation's biodefenses. At the same time, he said he worried about the threat to civil liberties inherent in expanding the government's authority through its anti-terrorism programs, noting that America was founded by people who had been abused not by someone else's government but by their own. He stressed his determination to safeguard individual freedom and civil liberties while strengthening the nation's defenses. Ultimately, he added, America's best defenses against unconventional warfare and bioterrorism in particular were scientific advances in deciphering genetic material in microbes and people so that vaccines could be tailored for quick response to an attack. And this would allow defense to stay ahead of offense, he said. And then he goes on to say, the Human Genome Project, the costly federally financed effort to map out human genetic material, was extremely valuable, an important part of the defensive shield he was trying to build. This, by the way, the reason why I'm having to read it is because it was omitted from the Amazon Audible audiobook. I wonder why. Maybe because it says clear as day. How could it be any more clear? The Human Genome Project, the costly, federally financed effort to map out human genetic material, was extremely valuable, an important part of the defensive shield he was trying to build. President Clinton, actually, and Craig Venter. Once the secrets of the human genome were unlocked, Clinton predicted that one day scientists would be able to take a blood sample and there would be a... It's Serrano's too. Clinton predicted that one day scientists would be able to take a blood sample and there would be a computer program which would show us if we had, let's say, a variant of anthrax. President Clinton had clearly been impressed, perhaps too much, by Craig Venter's enthusiastic predictions about the antibiotic and biodefense wonders that would miraculously flow from deciphering the human genome. But Clinton hoped that America would use each new wave of technology to close the gap between offense and defense, an optimism not widely shared by the government's military analysts and researchers. Until such rapid detection and response were possible, the United States would have to concentrate on deterring attackers armed with biological weapons. Alluding vaguely to unheralded but successful actions his administration had taken to delay efforts by rogue states and terrorists to acquire germ weapons, he warned that the use of such a weapon against Americans, provided that Washington knew had used it, would prompt at least a proportionate, if not disproportionate, response. It was unclear what he had in mind, and Clinton declined to elaborate, seeing virtue, as his predecessor George Bush, in leaving such threats vague. Clinton described elements of a proposal that he would announce the next day to strengthen the defenses against terrorists. Narrator's note again, this is taking place on January 21st, 1999, and the next day would be January 22nd, 1999, of which the events of that day will be expanded upon momentarily. Although President Clinton did not say so directly, the president seemed to be suggesting that his initiatives to combat terrorism and strengthen America's biodefenses were more important and ultimately should figure larger in his legacy than an affair with a young White House intern. Granting the interview was surely part of that strategy. When his aides told him that the 30 minutes scheduled for the meeting had elapsed, Clinton deflected a question about what kind of toll the Lewinsky scandal was taking on his family. He thought the worst was over, he said. Other than refusing to say whether he had been vaccinated against anthrax, he had not been, though the Secret Service had asked him not to discuss it. The scandal-related question was one of the few he sidestepped during the interview. But even as his White House handlers insisted that it was time to go, and other aides, who had been discreetly taping the interview, switched off their recorders and slipped out of the room, Clinton kept on talking. President Clinton dismissed those who argued that his administration had exaggerated the threat of bioterrorism. He said Anthony Lake, his former national security advisor and an early advocate of biodefense, had once told him, only half-jokingly, that the administration's proudest accomplishments would be preventing bad things from happening. The dog that didn't bark, he said. The $10 billion that he would seek from Congress to counter all forms of terrorism would be money well spent, despite what detractors and skeptics of the new, exotic 21st century threats might say. And if there were no terrible incidents, nobody would be happier than me 20 years from now, he said. His critics would probably say that Clinton was a kook and nothing happened. But if they go to say that, I would be the happiest man on earth.
On January 22, 1999, President Clinton announced his decision to ask Congress for $2.8 billion to thwart and prepare for attacks with biological and other exotic weapons and to combat computer warfare threats. The money for fiscal year 2001, more than double what he had sought the year before, was part of an overall request of $10 billion to defend the nation against terrorism. With Josh Lederberg at his side, Clinton outlined the major elements of his expanded anti-terrorism program in a speech to the National Academy of Sciences, a decidedly friendly audience.
Quick narrator's note. I searched for video of this presentation on January 22nd, 1999, where President Clinton was talking about bioterrorism with Joshua Lederberg at his side in front of the National Academy of Sciences. I can find articles documenting it, and I can find the transcript, but I cannot find video of this anywhere. For some odd reason, in spite of him being so prolific and so involved in so many things, it is remarkably difficult to find surviving video of Joshua Lederberg.
Members of his cabinet, senior military and prominent civilian scientists, and scores of officials from emergency preparedness agencies applauded and cheered as the president defended the program to the 300-some people who had packed the Academy auditorium. The initiatives included $683 million to train emergency workers in American cities to cope with a chemical or biological attack, $206 million to protect government sites, and $381 million for research on dangerous pathogens, the development of new vaccines and therapies, technology to detect and diagnose rare illnesses, and decontamination. The White House also asked for $87 million, a 23% increase over the previous year's spending, to improve the nation's public health surveillance system, and $52 million to continue building a national stockpile of antibiotics and medicines against anthrax, smallpox, and pneumonic plague. Clinton also wanted to triple current spending to a total of $24 million to create 25 urban medical response teams in major American cities. Only 4 cities, Miami, Denver, Washington, and Charlotte, North Carolina, had been able to assemble and train such teams. While the bulk of the $10 billion request would be spent strengthening security at U.S. embassies and at other American facilities, public health officials were delighted. For the first time in American history, said Donna Shalala, the Secretary for Health and Human Services, the public health system was being integrated into national security planning.
We are narrating this paragraph because several details of this paragraph were omitted from the Amazon Audible audiobook. Lederberg, too, had gotten some of the money he wanted for basic research into dangerous pathogens. In remarks introducing the president and the scientists to the audience, Sandy Berger, the president's national security advisor, noted that Lederberg had secured his place in scientific history by winning the Nobel Prize when he was only 33 years old. But the president hadn't done badly. Clinton was already governor of Arkansas by that age. When Clinton rose to speak, he told the audience that it could infer from his decision to enter into politics that he had been no good at chemistry and biology. The easy banter on the stage that day between the president and Josh sent a powerful signal to the federal bureaucracy. Lederberg and his fellow advocates of biodefense had influence at the White House that could no longer be ignored. Narrators note, even though mainstream media knew that, and even though authors knew that, and even though politicians knew that, for some reason, effectively, 100% of alternative media has managed to ignore it. Why does alternative media seem to have a top-down directive to never talk about Joshua Lederberg? I think you already know the answer to that.
The first major test of the biodefenders' clout came only a few months later when the administration debated whether to destroy the world's last known remaining stocks of the smallpox virus. The destruction of smallpox seemed an easy call. Eradication of smallpox had been one of the great achievements in the history of public health. The last known outbreak of the disease had occurred in Somalia in 1977, and 3 years later the World Health Organization had formally declared the disease eradicated. In 1996, WHO's governing body had recommended the destruction of the last remaining stocks, which were under tight security at 2 places, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta and Vector, Lev Sendakchev's Institute in Siberia. The target date for destruction was June 2000. But Russian and American intelligence analysts believed that other countries maintained hidden stocks of the virus. Sendakchev had said he was certain that North Korea, among other countries, was secretly keeping smallpox, and American analysts shared his view. Pentagon officials argued that a public ceremony announcing the elimination of the smallpox virus would be a charade. First, WHO had had no means to determine whether all countries had carried out their pledges to destroy existing stocks or transfer the virus to WHO repositories. It had simply accepted national declarations. Second, Pentagon officials believed that several nations, including American allies, had also secretly decided to maintain clandestine stocks. Even if every country was smallpox-free, the deadly virus might be recreated from related microbes if a country wanted to make new stocks. Smallpox, they argued, was simply too tempting a weapon to abandon. Finally, they argued, destroying the Russian and American stocks would complicate efforts to develop a new vaccine and antiviral drugs against the disease. America's population, which had not been vaccinated against smallpox since 1972, was particularly vulnerable. If the contagious virus was used in a terrorist attack, one expert said, we are all Indians, a reference to the devastating effect smallpox had on the Native American populations after European settlers had arrived. President Clinton was under heavy political pressure from arms control advocates and other largely Democratic constituencies to proceed with the destruction of the virus anyway, as a moral statement and a political example to the world. Respected scientists such as Donald A. Henderson, a former White House science advisor who had led the campaign to destroy the virus, argued that scientists did not need the actual virus to develop a new vaccine. His view was finding a sympathetic audience among many administration officials and in many developing countries. Lederberg and other opponents of destruction realized that they would have to marshal compelling arguments in order to secure a stay of execution for the virus. Fortunately for their cause, they had an ally in the White House, an effective bureaucrat with impeccable scientific credentials who happened to head an office in the National Security Council that Clinton had established to evaluate issues of public health and national security. For Kenneth Bernard, a physician who had served as Assistant Surgeon General before assuming the new White House post, the correct position was a no-brainer, as he had told friends in the biodefense community. In addition to concerns about Iraq and North Korea, Bernard knew that Ken Alibek had warned that the Soviets had weaponized smallpox and that the Russians might still be keeping genetically modified stocks for use in weapons. Of course, the destruction of the virus had to be postponed, Bernard believed, but building the case would not be easy. After all, the administration had initially favored the destruction in 1996 and now would be reversing itself. Realizing that Clinton would want to rely on expert scientific opinion and knowing that one of the nation's leading smallpox experts, Donald Henderson, fervently favored destruction, Bernard asked the National Academy of Sciences to form a committee to study the issue. Rather than ask the panel whether the virus should be kept or destroyed, Bernard persuaded the Academy to explore whether critical treatment advances would be lost if the virus were destroyed. The framing of the issue proved decisive. In March 1999, the panel concluded that such opportunities might indeed be sacrificed if the virus were eliminated. Proponents of destruction were furious, knowing that they were surely likely to lose the argument, at least for now. A month later, Clinton announced that the United States would fight to delay destruction when the WHO assembly met in Geneva in May. With Russia and the United States in agreement, the world reluctantly followed. WHO decided to postpone destroying the stocks until at least 2002. Bernard, Lederberg, and their allies had won an important round.
Smallpox was very much on Andy Weber's mind in the fall of 1999. He was attending a party in Koltsovo for the 25th anniversary of Vector, Russia's official smallpox repository, which had once specialized in turning viruses into weapons. The day-long festival was held on the once secret Siberian city's soccer field. The occasion was marked by tributes to and speeches commemorating the Institute's great but unmentionable achievements, as well as by parades by Vector veterans, displays of ballroom dancing by the children of the Institute's 2,000 scientists and technicians, and demonstrations of self-defense skills by Russian special forces. After lunch on a bitterly cold day, Andy Weber and an American friend accompanied Lev Sendakchiev, the Institute's director, and some of his Russian colleagues to the town cemetery. Sendakchiev raised a plastic cup of vodka to the memory of Nikolai Ustinov, that's Ustinov, a scientist who had died in the spring of 1988 after accidentally infecting himself with the Marburg virus, a hemorrhagic killer that he and his colleagues had been trying to perfect as a weapon. Standing beside Nikolai Ustinov's widow, Yevgenia, At the foot of her husband's still contaminated grave, Sendakchev toasted their fallen colleague and friend, who had documented the progress of the disease in a diary stained with his own blood. Sendakchev then emptied the remaining contents of his cup on his friend's grave, whose zinc-lined coffin was now covered with flowers and grass. Vodka, Andy Weber thought as he stared at the ground. How many Russians and germ warfare scientists in particular had drowned their misery and whatever moral compunctions they had about their work in vodka?
There was no plaque or public tribute to Ustinov.
No acknowledgement of how he had died. But Ustinov had achieved a perverse Soviet-style immortality. After his death, his colleagues at Vector had cultured the virus that killed him. The virus had mutated while passing through Ustinov's body, and the new variant, according to Ken Alabak, was particularly virulent and had been weaponized as a replacement for the original. Vector had called it Variant U, letter U, named after, which is really short for Variant Ustinov. Sendakchev turned away, tears streaming down his face, saying, "Thank God it's over." But Andy Weber wondered, was it really? And this is page 384, and 384 is the end of chapter 10 called The President. And this also concludes episode 380.A, and because we use hexadecimal, it's really 380.10 in decimal. And the timestamp on this in the Amazon Audible audiobook is we are in chapter 5, and we are 5 minutes and about 20 seconds into chapter 5. This is the last chapter of the Amazon audiobook, and this does include the conclusions section, which means there are effectively 3 chapters included in this one chapter 5 in the remaining 1 hour. So we can look forward to what we expect to be a lot more missing narration in the Amazon Audible audiobook. The next chapter is chapter 11 called Defenders, which starts on page 385. This was an extended chapter. I believe this is one of the most important chapters of one of the most important books that no one will mention. And I dare people, I'm openly daring people to start mentioning this book, mentioning it in chat, and bringing it up in their research. This book is not hard to find. It's out there. It's been out there since 2 days before, since several hours before September 11th, 2001. There's no reason for this book to have been ignored this long. There's no reason for the role, for the importance of Joshua Lederberg to have been ignored this long, especially with the events of COVID-19. So not only does this book provide a view into the real thinking that was going on in the back rooms about biological terror attacks and really of September 11th, 2001, and that were being planned for the rest of that year, and how the big win was going to be the Human Genome Project, which also was going to make the response capable. But I believe that the absence of this book being mentioned by so many people should provide to you a clue of just how warped and incompetent and biased and valueless so much of the alternative media is right now. I should not be the person doing this because I don't get paid. There are people making thousands of dollars a month, $5,000 a month as fellows from the Brownstown, $5,000 a month from the Wellcome Trust, several $1,000s a month, $20,000 a month from fake Substack accounts that are basically paid for with money which is laundered. They are getting money through insider trading stock tips, through signal chats with stocks which can go up and or go down, or being influenced by people and the SEC and FBI. That's how the majority of alt media is being paid right now. And if they were doing a little bit more good than harm, well, so be it. But very little has been exposed. In fact, nothing has been exposed. This book should have been mentioned by everyone and covered ad nauseum. But it hasn't. But you're here, you're listening to this, and I thank you. I thank you for being a supporter if you are. If you're not, well, at least share the links. Could I do more? Yeah. You want to hire me a team of 5 or 10 people to start being my editors and manage my communications? Fine, go for it. Other than that, we're here, and the question should be, why have several hundred people who all seem to be getting salaries not been able to get here? So we're going to continue on with the real story of September 11th, 2001, thanks to this book, and thanks to you for helping me cover the expenses of doing this work. Thank you much, everyone. Look forward to episode 280.b, which is going to be part 11, chapter 11, The Defenders. Thank you much, everyone. Take care, and God bless.